Hello there beautiful, how are you doing today? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Joesephyr, and in today's video we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into the various Ever Crisis Final Fantasy VII trailers that we've seen, and just kind of collecting all of the information that we've had about the game, considering it's meant to be being released within the next month or so, and we haven't had all that many details. They're pretty scarce, and a closed beta should be happening at some point soon, but using the knowledge I have of gacha games in general, particularly Square Enix related titles, and even more particularly Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, as well as the information we've been given through Famitsu interviews with Tetsuya Nomura and the like, this should hopefully give us a bit of a rounded view on what sorts of things we can expect from this title, and hopefully give us something to be excited about. Now before we get started, of course, don't forget to check out all of my social media links in the description box below, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord and Patreon. You can find me over on Twitch streaming all sorts of different things, including Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, Final Fantasy XIV, Final Fantasy IX, all sorts of other things, and of course I will be doing coverage on Ever Crisis when it releases, so we'll have that to look forward to, and I'm actually hoping to make it a part of my YouTube kind of cycle going forward. And of course, I do always shout out one of my patrons over on Patreon every time I release a video. And today that person is going to be Wolfie, who has been one of my longest running supporters and has been around for a very long time. I'm very lucky to have you as a friend for this amount of time. And their title card has Balthea on it and is one of my ultimate patrons. So if you're interested in getting a card made for you, just like this one, hand-drawn by me, then perhaps consider supporting the channel by taking a look in the description box below. Now, using the trailers that we've had, we can at least get a inclination as to the kind of things we can expect from this game. We know for a fact that it is going to be a mobile-only title that is releasing sometime in either September or October. I think some places have confirmed that it should be September, but I have also heard that it might be an October release date, and given that we haven't had the closed beta test even announced as of this video's making, I'm going to err on the side of caution with that one. So, we know that it's going to contain the entire compilation of Final Fantasy VII, including things that we've never really seen like for a long while now, including the likes of Before Crisis and Advent Children, which is extremely exciting to see. But given the amazing kind of visual flair, so using this video here, which I've taken from Final Fantasy's official channels here, you can see that there's a big contrast in the visual styles, using obviously more remake-focused visuals for the battles. But if we go back just a little bit, you can see that it's kind of more inspired by the original Final Fantasy VII for the field overlay. And I actually really like this this art style contrast. And even then, looking at the portraiture that you see just here over like for Cloud, it's very Nomura style artwork, which is something that we've come accustomed to over the years as Final Fantasy fans. So to see this artwork kind of rejuvenated in this particular title is actually really exciting. Though I hope that some of the in-game costumes that we've seen in some of the trailers, as well as obviously stuff that comes out in the future, maybe get released with some draw from other art styles, like maybe Yoshitaka Amano or Yoshida from FF12 and Tactics and the like. I think it'd be really nice to see that kind of mix-up. Speaking of that battle system, like as you can see here, it is going to be entirely turn-based, and I did want to kind of pause the video just here, as I believe that the way the battle system is going to work is going to be very reminiscent of another gacha game that actually isn't Final Fantasy related. I believe it's going to be reminiscent of Pokemon Masters EX. If you've played that, and there's actually quite a lot of gacha style games that use this kind of system, you can see here where they have just above sort of the movesets that are all there, that one bar that focuses kind of like an ATB gauge. But I think that if you look at the armor break move there, it has little bars on top of it that to me suggest that that bar at the top will fill up over time, and then those abilities will be used sort of using that gauge, and you can just spend your movements in order to use that. And then here you can see that you've got Tifa and Barret on the side there. And I think that the way that it will work is you can switch between Tifa and Barret by pressing their portrait, and it will pull their abilities up, and you draw from the same gauge as that. So you'd be able to switch between characters on the fly by tapping those portraits. And we've known that this is a solid working system in other games, and I can see how it would work well here as well. We do know that things like summons and limit breaks are going to be a thing within the game, although we don't really know exactly how they're going to work within the game, nor how they correlate to the gacha system. For those of you who aren't aware, Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis is very much going to be a free-to-play title that contains microtransactions in the form of a gacha-based system. So you will be using chance-based sort of draws, like a lottery system, to try and obtain weapons for the various characters in the game, and there'll be varying rates for that. Now, a lot of people weren't sure about this to begin with, but we now know, and we have known for quite some time, that this was the case. Now, if this is anything like Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, which is a game I am very, very familiar with, and, you know, it does apparently claim to draw a lot of inspiration from Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, as we've seen through various interviews with Tetsuya Nomura, the weapons and the things that you acquire for the characters will augment certain skills, so that if you get those weapons, you'll be made more strongly, and I mean, this is just pure speculation, but that would be what my estimation is based on my previous experience. Now, I want to focus on this little bit up here where we have Tifa in an alternate outfit and Aerith in another alternate outfit. Now, the monetization in these apparent sort of interviews that we've had have drawn many comparisons to Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, seeing as we know that weapons are the thing that you'll be pulling for, not the characters that wield them. And differently from Dissidia, it would seem that the costumes that you see in the trailer for Tifa and Aerith are actually attached to the gacha itself and come with the weapon, so like the high-end rarity weapons will come with some of these costumes, which is actually different from Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, where in that game, instead of obtaining the costumes as part of the game, they were bought separately in real money bundles. Now, I also do imagine that this will probably be the case in Ever Crisis as well, as, you know, they have to make their money some way, and I think that that's going to be a very easy way for them to do that. One thing that we're not aware of when it comes to the monetization of this game is, sadly, when it comes to any kind of free-to-play title, particularly one with gacha-based mechanics, not only do we have to worry about whether the game itself is actually any good or not, but we also have to consider whether the monetization of the game is kind, whether it's, you know, generous, and whether free-to-play players will be able to play it like with a varying degree of success and all of that kind of thing. And in a very large number of gacha-based games, duplicate copies of obtainable items have varying functions within the game. In some games, in order to maximize the potential of an item or a character or whatever the obtainable might be, you need to get multiple copies of that item. And in some cases, like Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, which is a really good place for Ever Crisis to be basing a lot of its systems on, if that's the way that they're actually going about it, it's a great place to go because duplicates are a thing in that game, but there are ways around it. Like, if you get different items, you can use those as substitutes in their own way for like a 5-star item in that game. However that turns out to be in this one, you can equate that to a duplicate in that game in a different way. So hopefully that translates over to this particular title as well, but we don't know for sure how that's going to go. One of the biggest concerns that I see from any new gacha title, especially one that has an existing kind of IP attached to it, is that they're worried that the story is going to be inaccessible and that you'll have to start forking over cash, things like that. Well, I wouldn't say that people who are only concerned about any story that might be present in Ever Crisis that's relevant to anything else outside of it is something that they need to worry about, because the story is very, very often the easiest aspect of any gacha title. So that's not something you need to worry about, as it's extremely unlikely that you would be unable to experience all of the cutscenes and any ties to the FF7 greater universe until you started forking over cash. That's very, very rarely the case, certainly not in any gacha game I've ever played. We have been told in interviews that chapters, as they're being called, will be released every month, with the original Final Fantasy VII game taking up about 10 of those chapters, and other games in the Final Fantasy compilation, including the likes of Before Christ and Advent Children, will have their own chapters, and most likely they'll have events attached to them, which will be where more difficult content comes from, the items that you'd want to be pulling for various rare items in order to try and beat. But if you're concerned about the story and the story alone and the collection of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII as a whole, I don't think that's something you really need to worry about. This is, of course, further documented here by this Silicon Era article that I pulled up. I actually watched this in Mr. Happy's video and used the same article that he's using, so all credit goes to him for finding this particular article here. It says here that even in for players only interested in the story, the chapters of FF7 Ever Crisis will be considerable in size. The original Final Fantasy VII is expected to, as I said, take up about 10 chapters, with players escaping Midgard by the 3rd chapter. The game won't be a lockstep recreation of FF7 of its spin-offs though, as is evidenced by screenshots of things like seeing Aerith in the party during the first boss battle, which, as you can see here, during the boss battle with the Scorpion Sentinel, you can spot Aerith right in the corner of that fight, so you can see that she's playable within that fight. And it mixes things up a little bit to take new challenges unbound by the narrative. The story itself will also feature new content as well as original chapters focusing on things like the backstory of FF7 the First Soldier or the younger days of characters who appear in other Final Fantasy VII games. So this gives me pause to start looking in this direction. So if you've caught up with the Ever Crisis trailers so far, you will see this character that has popped up here. So we now know for a fact that this is Sephiroth in his younger days, presumably prior to obtaining Masamune and being the icon that we know him to be. Now, I think it's a great idea for this game to have its own original events, confirmed to be written as well by Nojima, Final Fantasy VII's original main scenario writer. However, we have an example of this not necessarily going the way the developers think it will. I do worry a little bit that it will go down the road that Kingdom Hearts Union Cross did in making aspects of the story really relevant to the greater lore of the franchise, which in my opinion has an adverse effect of making people feel alienated for not playing the mobile title rather than enticing people to want to play it, as showing young Sephiroth could end up with underlying necessity going forward into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and beyond. I hope that's not the case, and I hope that what this is a deeper lore dive for players of the Final Fantasy VII franchise that actively want to dive into those kinds of stories without making it feel like they have to do it to understand the greater lore at play. I do also want to put out that having Genesis having a reappearance in this game will hopefully quell those claims that his likeness wasn't able to be used because of his likeness to the Rockstar Gact, and hence his not being used for a while, as it's pretty clear that he's in this game at the very least during any Crisis Core portions of the game, and I'd be pretty surprised if he didn't become playable at some point during this game's lifespan. One other thing I find interesting here that will present an interesting dilemma for Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis is the fact that it's limited to Final Fantasy VII. I mean, that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of gacha games out there that have crossovers with varying other titles, and I'd be surprised, honestly, if the Nier character didn't show up in there at some point due to the developer of the game and its ties to Nier. But the fact of the matter is, Final Fantasy VII itself doesn't have that many characters in it that are prominent enough to want people to pull on them all the time. So while you have your playable characters, I'm just pulling up some characters from the Final Fantasy wiki here. So you have your playable characters, optional characters, Sephiroth, Shinra characters, the Turks, Avalanche members, and then varying other characters that come from... That's just FF7 on its own, not counting, obviously, characters from the greater franchise. The mobile games typically tend to draw from all of the Final Fantasy franchise. So it's going to be really interesting to see if some characters maybe get separate forms, although the news that costumes are related to the gacha instead makes me wonder if some characters will get more support than others. So like the main characters like Cloud, like Zack, etc. will get more attention because they'll get a wider variety of weapons made available for them. Although that could also cause a wonky balancing issue, or perhaps more attention will be given to characters with smaller parts in the franchise, like maybe Elena, or Bugenhagen, Cisne, or even, God forbid, someone like Don Corneo. There's a lot of potential characters within the FF7 franchise, but not many of them have massive roles in the games, so it'll be interesting to see how they go about this. Another thing that I'm going to be curious to see how they tackle this particular issue is that consideration that Ever Crisis is being made to establish common ground among the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and therefore one has to wonder how this game is going to try to appeal to players who have possibly only played Final Fantasy VII Remake or are coming to this as a fan of gacha mobile titles as opposed to Final Fantasy VII. Well, spoilers, obviously, for anyone who hasn't played Final Fantasy VII Remake, you are being warned now, but that game directly subverts the narrative that this game is trying to portray. and how it's going to navigate being appealing to those newcomers without alienating existing fans is going to be really interesting. It's quite a feat to juggle a common ground between existing Final Fantasy VII fans, newcomer fans through Remake, and of course those general gacha game fans as well. And I think that how this game develops its monetization and its fairness towards its players is going to be very, very apt in its success. So the name of the company that is developing Ever Crisis alongside Square Enix is a company named Aplabot, and the game that they are most well known for making is Nier Reincarnation. Now, as you can see in the trailer that I'm just showing off here, Nier Reincarnation is also an extremely pretty game, although having spoken to other players of that game, there's a lot of grindiness in that game that a lot of people weren't very happy about because it's pretty extensive and the gacha can be very unforgiving. Although in that game there were two separate gachas, one for the characters and another for the weapons. So the fact that we've seen that it's only weapons that you're pulling for within Ever Crisis gives me some level of hope, because honestly, I wouldn't have thought Square Enix would willingly hand off their biggest franchise without a considerable level of thought, especially while it's seeing new heights of popularity thanks to Remake, Rebirth, etc. So I really hope that Ever Crisis takes Dissidia as its inspiration, and the claims that it does so are sound, and it takes that road rather than the one that Nier Reincarnation has done. The only other real information we have on Ever Crisis in terms of it, like visuals and things that we can see, is this trailer that we have here, which is its opening cutscene. And this is obviously showing characters from Soldier, presumably from the first Soldier, as it's going to heavily tie into that game as well. And whether this means that the relationship with the other games means it's going to be developed in a chronological order, so releasing first Soldier content, then Before Crisis, then Crisis Core, then Final Fantasy VII, remains to be seen. But again, I find it hard to believe that they would release Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis without any kind of access to Cloud and the like, or Sephiroth, or anything like that, especially considering that one of your biggest reveals for Ever Crisis was the or just the young Sephiroth reveal, because that's a big deal for everybody, and people are going to want to sink their teeth into that. And First Soldier, from what I gather, isn't the most successful title in the world, so I wouldn't put all of their eggs in that basket. So that's pretty much all of the information that we have on Ever Crisis up until this point. I will be trying my absolute best to report on any new news that comes out for Ever Crisis. If I can participate in its closed beta test, I absolutely will. And I really hope that this is one of the fairer gacha games out there. Like, Square Enix has had a lot of success with its gacha titles, and I really hope to see it continued with Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis, because when they're good, they are genuinely very good, and I would like to be able to help guide people through a new title in this kind of vein for the Final Fantasy franchise, particularly for FF7 fans who've maybe never played a gacha title like that before, and try and make it look just that little bit less overwhelming and scary for people who perhaps haven't delved into the gacha world before. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think of Ever Crisis. Is it something that you're excited about? Is it something that you plan on playing? Is it something that you've kind of shunned because of its nature as a free-to-play mobile title? Let me all know all of that stuff in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making. And that's going to be it from me. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care, beautiful. Bye now.